Want to welcome everybody to the next lesson. This is on First Corinthians. Make sure that you've got your notes downloaded so that you're ready to go. And as we go through this issue, looking at the book of First Corinthians, is really about a plea, for peace, holiness, and fidelity. And out of all the books of the New Testament, there's probably less discussion on critical issues than any other book. Paul really kind of just deals with some issues within the church, questions that they have, which we'll take a look at. And as we look at First Corinthians, pretty much again, Paul's authorship, or what we call the Pauline authorship, is really uncontested. That means that a lot of scholars, both liberal and conservative, believe that Paul is the author, and both First and Second Corinthians are really considered to be what's a German word, which is Hauptbrett, which is the chief of Paul's letters. This is considered a one, along with what I would probably say the book of Romans, are Paul's chief letters, because they're kind of the cornerstone of all of Paul's teachings. Paul is writing to the church that is in Corinth, which, if you notice, is right down here. Remember, this is modern day Greece. This is Macedonia up here. Over here is modern day Turkey, which is also referred to as Asia Minor. This would be the boot of Italy. And so Corinth was considered to be important because it was a land link between the East and the West, also then both militarily and economically. What would happen is that ships a lot of times would come in and then cross over onto another side and continue on out. And it was also a land link between the main part of Greece and then the little island that sticks out here off the coast. And so it was a very important city to deal with. And for Paul, when we talk about Corinth, we talk about the Old Corinth, which was completely destroyed around 146 BC by the Roman Republic as they took over from the Grecian Empire. And a place, it was really what I would call a place of incredible license. One person counted that they had at one point over 1,000 temple prostitutes who were available for use within the temple to be a part of worship or sacrifice. It was very liberal in its understanding. One person coined the word to Corinthianize, and that was to act like a prostitute or to visit a prostitute. And to be known as a Corinthian girl was to be known as a prostitute, mostly ritual prostitution that was used as part of making a sacrifice to some kind of god, and the prostitution was used in that. So for you ladies, somebody to call you a Corinthian girl is not a very good thing. That is, you would be known as a prostitute. Now, around 46 BC, Julius Caesar decides to rebuild the city as part of the Roman colony. And so during Paul's time, the access of the old Corinthians was not to the same level, but it was a major center of commerce, entertainment, and again, vice. And one New Testament scholar, Gordon Fee, labeled it was probably like the New York or Los Angeles or even the Las Vegas of the ancient world. So what happens in Corinth stays in Corinth. Now, at the time of Paul's writings, they had a large Jewish element, which is one of the reasons that Paul was attracted to it. This inscription picture right here is actually part of a synagogue, and you can see here what I've done is I've taken the letters that appear in this section and filled them in, and so what you would have seen is the idea written in Greek, but would be showing that it's a synagogue, so synagogue of the Hebrews. And so according to Acts 18:4, there was a large Jewish population. I'm going to put some pictures up here. This is a road going into Corinth, some walls in the old city part. This would have been kind of the old main entrance into the city of Corinth at that time. And so it's a very interesting city, one that has a lot of rich history. Now, Paul is probably writing from the city of Ephesus, because he says in 1 Corinthians 16:8, he says, I'm going to remain in Ephesus until the Pentecost, which takes place about 40 to 50 days after Easter. And so he's writing from the city of Ephesus to the church in Corinth. He had planted this. This goes back to our missionary map, most likely on his second missionary journey. So he would have come from Thessalonica. He came down to Corinth. Remember from our discussion of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, he writes back to them while he's in Corinth. After he's in Corinth for a while, he travels across the Aegean Sea to the city of Ephesus, and then that's where he writes back to the church of Corinth. Paul is also going to visit them during his third missionary journey. And so he receives sometime during the third missionary journey some questions and some issues that go on. And so it's during this time that he writes them a letter discussing some questions that they had, and he writes back to them. Now, there is some discussion within 1 Corinthians. In chapter 5, verse 9, he says, I wrote to you in my previous letter not to associate with immoral people. Now, what that means is most likely that Paul had written to the church in Corinth before, but for some reason we do not have that letter. So it's what we would consider to be a lost letter. So in 1 Corinthians, he says, hey, I previously wrote to you. Evidently, they had received the letter. And so they're writing back to Paul, hey, we've got some questions about what's going on that we need some answers to. And so Paul is going to do two things in 1 Corinthians. He's going to write to correct some issues and some misunderstanding, but he's also going to write to them to answer some questions that they have. And that's about the second half of the book. Now, some of the problems that Paul is going to address is there are some partisan groups. This is the passage. Some say, Paul writes, says, hey, some of you say you're of Paul, some of you say you're of Apollos, some of you say you're of this, some of you say you're of Jesus. And so there was within the church some issues that needed to be addressed. He's also going to address some personal attacks against Paul. People were attacking him, which is pretty common within ministry, that people attack maybe the leader. He is going to address some abuses during the Lord's Supper, things that would take place. A lot of it is immorality. He's going to address some issues of immorality. Believers bringing lawsuits against each other. Spiritual gifts. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And then false doctrine, especially the resurrection. Chapter 15 is one of the great passages dealing with the resurrection, and we learn a lot about what happened after the resurrection and who Jesus appeared to outside of the Gospels. Now, Paul is probably writing around AD 55. He actually meets two Jewish refugees, Aquila and Priscilla. He does a lot of work with them. When he talks about the Gallio, which places Gallio as a proconsul between the middle of 51 through around the middle of 52, and Paul has a hearing, according to Acts, Paul has a hearing around that time. And so probably around 51, Paul leaves Corinth. He arrives in Jerusalem. And then he's in Ephesus back around 52 to 55. And that's when he writes back to them during his third missionary journey. And so probably 1 Corinthians is probably written late, probably early 55, somewhere in that time. Again, his purpose is to correct some quarrels or sins or issues that are being addressed and some errors. He answers a list of questions and he prepares them for a visit that probably Timothy and Paul are going to make. Now, the outline is basically pretty simple. In the first 6 chapters, he just deals with some problems. He says, let me tell you what's going on. This is how you're going to deal with it. You got these problems. This is what you need to do. And then the rest of the chapter, 7 through 14, he answers those questions. So he takes their letter and he says, okay, here's the answer. Here's a question. Here's the answer. And he kind of goes back and forth for what he's heard and the reports that he's giving. One of the standout verses of 1 Corinthians, there are a lot, would come at the end of the 1 Corinthians, is verse 13 and 14 out of chapter 16, is to be on alert, is to stand firm in the faith, to act like men and to be strong. Let all that you have done be in love. So let me put up some of these key facts. He's writing to the church of Corinth, probably around chapter 18, verse 24. He's writing from Ephesus to correct sins and quarrels from the church. He's about sanctifying the church, and there are the key verses. I want to remind you to make sure that you're keeping up with your assignments. Make sure that you're keeping up with your reading, not only from your textbook, but from your verses from the Bible. And as always, if you have questions about something from the video or if you're reading, please don't hesitate to email me. Have a great day.